Chapter 6. Suggestion in Lower Animal Life. If the most rigid adherent to the strictest rules of scientific, inductive investigation of the phenomena of nature were to be asked to name the kind and amount of evidence necessary to demonstrate scientifically the truth of the proposition that amenability to suggestion is a universal limitation of the subjective mind, he would doubtless reply that it must be clearly shown that the law embraces the lower animals, and that no amount of research or quality of evidence that did not include the lower animals could possibly establish so broad a generalization, no matter how strong the evidence might be that it is a universal limitation of man's subjective powers. Otherwise, it might eventually be found to be a phenomenon incident alone to the environmental conditions with which man is surrounded, and not a universal law of the subjective mind. In other words, if it is a universal law of the subjective mind, it must apply to all subjective minds, of whatever grade of intelligence. It follows that if it cannot be shown that animals are subject to the law of suggestion in precisely the same way that man is, the idea that it is a universal law must be abandoned. On the other hand, our most rigid scientist would admit that if it can be shown that, allowing for the difference in the grade of intelligence, the law applies to the lower animals the same as it does to the human species, it can be fairly claimed that the universality of the law of suggestion has been demonstrated as clearly as any psychological proposition is demonstrable. The same remark applies to the law of duality. In fact, since duality and suggestion are correlative propositions, as I have already pointed out, they must stand or fall together, from whatever point of view they may be considered. The first question, then, to be determined is, what evidence exists to show duality in the mental organism of the lower animals? Or, in other words, what evidence exists to show that they are endowed with the subjective mind as distinguished from the objective mind? To this the broad answer must be returned, provisionally, that all the facts of organic evolution, physical and mental, conspire to demonstrate the proposition. The scientific evolutionist will at once admit that duality in man presupposes the same in his earthly ancestors. If man is descended from the lower animals, and no scientist now pretends to doubt the truth of that proposition, it necessarily follows that all the salient characteristics of man's mental organism exist, in embryo, in that of his humble progenitors. Besides, it is a time-worn proposition of evolutionary science that the potentialities of manhood reside in the lowest unicellular organism. In point of fact, the most conclusive evidence of the existence of a subjective mind, and consequently of duality, is found in the lower animals, from the monarch to man. For in tracing the ancestry of man backward to the first manifestation of life and mind in unorganized Haeckel protoplasm, the Mon era, we find that the subjective mind antedated the objective mind by untold millions of years. Haeckel tells us that during more than 1/2 of all the millions of years that have elapsed since the beginning of organic life on this planet, no animal possessing a brain was in existence. It follows that the brain is a product of organic evolution. Like every other physical organ, it was evolved in response to a necessity to supply a long-felt want, to serve a purpose for which the subjective mind was not adapted. The latter is the mind of instinct in the lower animals, the mind of intuition in man, which is a distinction without a real difference in function. The primary instincts with which it was endowed were sufficient for the ordinary purposes of animal life in its native environment. But as animals grew in number and variety, environmental conditions were constantly changing, and new or secondary instincts were required to enable the animals to adapt themselves to new environments. All biologists agree that animals require secondary instincts, that is, new instincts, for this purpose, and that they acquire them by a definite process, that is to say, they first meet the new conditions, wants, dangers, etc. intelligently, and after the new habits thus acquired have been practiced for several generations, these habits become crystallized into instincts, and are thenceforward inherited the same as the primary instincts. It will thus be seen that they tacitly admit that there are two grades or kinds of intelligence in evidence even in the lower animals, namely, instinctive intelligence, and the other kind, which they do not name. But, as I have shown elsewhere, they are hopelessly at sea as to when this new intelligence, which is thus able to cope with new environments and to educate the instinctive intelligence, came into existence, and how it performs its functions. In other words, they are hopelessly at variance as to when animals began to reason. The dual hypothesis, however, renders a solution of these problems perfectly obvious, for we have only to refer to the facts of experience to enable us to find it. Thus, we know that the brain is the organ of the reasoning mind, that mind alone is endowed with inductive powers, and that it is only by the exercise of these powers that we are enabled to cope with the constantly changing environmental conditions of physical life. We know that the greater our inductive powers are, the more perfectly we are armed for the struggle for life, which is a struggle to overcome or adapt ourselves to adverse environmental conditions. And we know that in the entire absence of these powers we should be as helpless as the amoebae. We know, therefore, that the mind of which the brain is the organ is especially adapted to the necessities of a physical life, and we infer, with unanswerable logic, that the brain, with its highly specialized powers and functions, was a product of organic evolution. Moreover, we are confirmed in this induction by the fact that it appeared at the opportune moment, that is to say, when it became a necessity as a means of promoting the further progressive development of organic life. From that moment, mere brute force ceased to be the only factor in the survival of the fittest. Induction supplanted it just in proportion to the development of that power, until in man it is the predominant factor, for it not only gives him dominion over the whole brute creation, but over the forces of nature. In other words, it enables him to create his own environment in defiance of adverse conditions. Let me not be misunderstood in reference to the inductive powers of the lower animals. Induction is simply the process of estimating the relative and the cumulative values of facts. In its higher development, it enables us to learn something of the laws of nature and to harness its forces for the uses of mankind. Its simplest processes are employed in discriminating between two or more facts, and the first brain that was developed in animal life on this planet performed that function. It was feeble, of course, but it served its purpose, for the animal with brains survived and soon dominated the organic world. Feeble as were its powers in the B86, the law of mental medicine ginning, it was able to educate the subjective mind, and thus create or develop secondary instincts adapted to new and constantly changing environmental conditions. The result was what one would have a right to expect under the theory of the dominating influence of the objective mind, namely, the animals that possess the greatest objective intelligence are invariably endowed with the most complex instincts. All modern biologists now admit that this is a rule without a known exception. It follows that the objective mind is the dominating factor in the mental organism of the lower animals just the same as it is in that of man, and that the vast congeries of complex secondary instincts with which men and animals are endowed originated in each case in the objective mind. How? Let Darwin answer. Intelligent actions, after being performed during several generations, become converted into instincts and are inherited, as when birds on oceanic islands learn to avoid man. Romanes extends the same principle in the following language. Intelligent adjustments, when frequently performed, become automatic in the individual, and next they are inherited till they become automatic habits in the race. Darwin's reference to the birds on oceanic islands points to a very apt illustration of the principle under consideration. When the white man first made his appearance on those hitherto uninhabited islands, he found the native birds to be devoid of the fear of man. Having never seen one, they were unaware that the human biped in his savage and semi-savage state is the natural enemy of all birds. But they soon learned the lesson, and they learned, moreover, that he was armed with a weapon that was fatal to birds at long distances. The result was that they soon intelligently adapted themselves to the new environmental conditions. That is, they avoided the new danger by making themselves exceedingly scarce in the immediate vicinity of the man behind the gun. It is further alleged that they very soon learned to measure with great accuracy the effective range of the guns, just as our native crows have learned to know the same thing, and, moreover, to keep pace with modern improvements in firearms. It is further stated, with reference to the sea island birds, that the generations of young birds born immediately subsequent to the advent of man were as fearless in presence of the latter as were their ancestors when man first invaded their habitat, and remained so until they were educated by the example of the older birds, or learned the lesson from their own experience. Nevertheless, after an intelligent avoidance of the new danger during several generations, the fear of man was converted into an inheritable instinct. And thereafter the youngest bird was as fearful of his enemy as was his most experienced ancestor. The question now is, what were the mental processes employed in the creation of the new instinct? Obviously, the first step involved was the exercise of the powers of induction, for there were at least three facts to correlate and a conclusion to be drawn. The first fact was the man, the second was the gun, and the third was the effective range of the gun. And the conclusion was that within certain limits of distance, which the bird was able to measure or estimate with practical exactitude, the man and the gun constituted a combination that was fatal to birds. Whether the bird was able to consider the man and the gun as separate or separable factors in the combination, our informant does not state. But it is well known to every American farmer's boy that our native crow is able to perform that inductive feat. That is to say, he knows that the crow is provokingly fearless of man when the latter is without a gun and correspondingly shy when the fatal combination is in evidence. Moreover, the crow is able to correlate the three factors, namely, the man, the gun, and a certain definite area of territory, and he knows that the elimination of any one of them is fatal to the efficiency of the combination. This is just as truly a process of induction as was that which Newton employed in his search for the law of gravitation, and it just as certainly involves the collection, classification, and correlation of facts for the purpose of arriving at a general conclusion, as did the process which Kepler employed in his search for his three laws of planetary motion. Being a process of induction, it follows that it originated in the objective mind, the mind of which the brain is the organ, the mind of intelligence, as distinguished from the mind of instinct, the mind whose office it is to educate the subjective, or instinctive intelligence, and guide it through the intricate mazes of a physical environment. Is there any doubt as to the scientific accuracy of the last proposition? Locke says that God does not make noble things for ignoble uses, which is true in a limited sense. If he had said that God does not make noble things without any uses, he would have propounded a universal postulate, for its opposite is inconceivable. And this is precisely what God would have done if he had created a brain intelligence capable of inductive reasoning, when there was already in existence an organized intelligence endowed with the same powers and capable, actually or potentially, of performing the same functions. It is an axiom of evolutionary science that no physical organ was ever evolved except in response to a necessity growing out of physical environmental conditions, and this is as true of the brain, with its distinctive functions and faculties, as it is of the antennae of the humblest insect. As I have repeatedly had occasion to observe, that which is now designated as the subjective mind exists in all sentient organisms, from the monarch to man. Its salient characteristics are the same now as in the primordial epoch, varying only in degree, and its one salient limitation of power is due to what science, for want of a better name, has designated as the law of suggestion. I have also shown that comparatively late in the history of organic evolution a new mental power was developed, capable of supplying the deficiency due to the limiting law, and thus imparting a fresh impetus to progressive development in the organic world. I repeat that this new power would not have been evolved but for the necessity which existed, and hence the specific character of the new power is demonstrative evidence of the character of the deficiency or limitation. Not that it imparted any new powers to the already existent mental organism, but that it was able intelligently to direct and promote the enlargement of the scope of the old. I have endeavored to point out the process by which this was begun, namely, by the development of new or secondary instincts, and that this was possible only under the correlative laws of duality and suggestion. I have said that no new powers were imparted to the subjective mind, nor were its limitations removed. Obviously, that would be impossible without changing or repealing a law of nature. The same limitations must always exist so long as it is hedged about by a physical environment. It will thus be seen, 1. That all progressive increase of animal intelligence beyond primordial conditions is due to the development of secondary instincts from time to time, in response to the necessities growing out of new and constantly changing environmental conditions. 2. That the acts of secondary instincts are at first intelligently performed and are afterward crystallized into inheritable instincts. 3. That the intelligence, which thus adapts itself to new environmental conditions, is primarily that of the objective, or brain, mind. 4. That the objective mind was, and is, the instructor of the subjective mind. And 5. That all progressive development of animal intelligence is due to the suggestions of the objective mind to the subjective mind. It follows that all evolutionary development of animal intelligence is due to the law of suggestion. That is to say, all acquisitions of knowledge that are inheritable and therefore permanent and valuable to the species are due to that one universal law. For until animal intelligence is converted into an instinct, it is not inheritable, and until it is inheritable, it is not permanent, and until it is permanent, it is of little value to them in the struggle for life. What is true of the lower animals is also true of the higher animals, including man. The same law that prevails in the acquisition of the secondary instincts which enable the lower animals to cope successfully with new environmental conditions enables man to assert and to maintain his dominion over all the animal creation, to educate his children, and to train them for future usefulness in the moral and intellectual realms. Were it not for the law of suggestion, it would be impossible for man to tame a tiger, subdue an elephant, or break a horse. Thus, everyone is aware that in order successfully to reduce a horse to permanent subjection to the will of man, he must be made to believe that man is stronger than a horse. This is usually done by throwing the animal and holding him down until he ceases to struggle. When that has been successfully accomplished, the rest is easy, for the suggestion has thus been imparted to the limited intelligence of the horse that it is useless to struggle against superior strength. This principle prevails in all encounters between man and the lower animals, and just in proportion to man's success in imparting that suggestion to the animal he seeks to subdue, will he succeed in rendering the animal permanently obedient and docile. In a word, man is enabled to assert and maintain his dominion over the animal creation solely by virtue of the law of suggestion. It follows that the law of suggestion is an essential factor in the evolution of civilization as well as in the evolution of animal intelligence. As such, it is the antithesis of the law of heredity, which has been rightly termed the conservative factor in evolution. Heredity simply preserves what has been gained by evolution. It takes no step in advance. It accomplishes no new result. Indeed, its tendencies, under the law of atavism, are retrogressive. Evolution, with all its factors and forces, is progressive, and as suggestion is its prime factor, especially in moral and intellectual advancement, it follows, as before remarked, that suggestion is the antithesis of heredity. In this sense, therefore, suggestion may be defined as the one means available to man whereby he may avoid, overcome, or neutralize the evils due to heredity. It is, therefore, not only the prime and all-potent factor in the evolutionary development of animal life and intelligence, but it is the one supreme psychological factor, without which human civilization would be impossible. Enough has now been said to show that the first two terms of our hypothesis are demonstrable propositions. It remains to prove that the third term is equally veridical, namely, that the subjective mind controls the functions, sensations, and conditions of the body. This we may assume, for the present, to have been provisionally established by the testimony of a cloud of witnesses, including that of the ablest members of the medical profession, to say nothing of the innumerable evidences of it in the records of cures of disease under the 1,001 systems of mental healing, generically known to science as suggestive therapeutics. But it will more fully appear as we proceed with the discussion hereinafter.